All right, now finally to address my standard astrophotography settings on my A7R4. This will be similar on many Sony cameras from the earlier generations. I think it changes with the A7R5 mainly. First of all, I have a memory preset on my A7R4. I set it for number 3 here on my mode dial on the top of the camera. And here you can see some of the standard settings that I have it kind of locked in for. Um, I set it to manual so I can manually control the exposure. I also set it to bulb because most astrophotography software tends to like the bulb setting so it can manipulate the length of the exposure. F1.8 is just because one of my lenses, its maximum aperture is one f1.8. ISO 320, that's where I find the dynamic range to generally be uh, best, either at ISO 100 or at 320. You can, of course, choose other options, but for dynamic range purposes, this is what I stick with. Um, Most of the other settings here are not relevant for astrophotography. You can see that I have it set to RAW capture instead of using JPEG. And let's move on to the menu system. All right. I'll go through it page by page. I may edit this to for brevity. But here, as you can see, I have the file format again as RAW. The raw file type I choose is uncompressed. You might be able to get away with compressed files, but I tend to think with the extreme uh, dynamic range that you're dealing with astrophotography, you're dealing with very, very dim objects and bright point sources. The point sources would be the stars, and the dim objects would be galaxies and nebulae and that sort of thing. So I tend to keep it with uncompressed because I want to make sure I'm maintaining as much unmolested data as possible. You can ignore the JPEG settings. Long exposure noise reduction, you need to set that to off. Otherwise, it will add additional exposures between each light exposure. It's going to take a dark frame, um, which it automatically applies. So you don't get the dark frame for processing in your image processor, but it automatically applies it. And I generally don't recommend that for a number of reasons. For one thing, while it's taking that long exposure noise reduction frame, your astrophotography software, such as N.I.N.A or uh, you know any of a number of other programs, might get confused because it's expecting that after the light exposure, it should be able to just move on to its own dark exposure, or it might just start timing and preparing for the next light exposure, and it will try to take the next light exposure before this long exposure noise reduction has been fully completed by the camera. In which case, the astrophotography software will just lock up and stop working. If you are shooting on the camera's built-in intervalometer, however, then you might be able to use this to some advantage. Um, Mainly, it's a shortcut. I think probably you get better results just taking separate dark frames and applying them in your post-processing software. The lens compensation settings. It's important to turn these off because these settings will apply to your raw files. And sometimes when you make a stack of files as it's very common to do stacking with astrophotography. Um, any adjustments made to those raw files are also going to stack, and they start to show up as aberrations in your images, in the stacked images. So the only one that you might consider applying is the distortion compensation. Typically, it will mainly just crop the image, but there again, not really advantageous. I wouldn't recommend using any of these for astrophotography. Next page, a lot of these will not be relevant if you are using N.I.N.A or another astrophotography software to run your imaging sequence. You'll want to leave your bracket settings off. You don't want to have any bracketing done in the camera because, again, that'll confuse the program, the N.I.N.A or the other Astro programs. The interval shoot function. This is great if you are not using any Astro software to control your imaging sequence. If you're just going to set the camera on a tripod or a star tracker and let the camera do all of the photography and control the sequence, then this is what you want. You want your interval shooting. You can turn it on, um, and the shooting interval is pretty irrelevant. 1 second is the fastest you can set it. If you feel that your tripod is kind of wobbly, you might set it a little longer so that after every shot, there's a moment or two for the any vibrations to smooth out. And the shooting start time, this just gives you time to initiate the interval shooting and step away from the tripod. You might want that to be a few seconds if you're manually pushing the shutter button to start your interval shooting. Um, Number of shots, that's going to depend on your target and how long you can stay on it throughout the night. So you could do like 120 shots at 30 seconds a piece if you're gonna have that much time on your target. Or you could do more. I don't know what the maximum is. I've never uh, tried to go to a maximum, but I think the most I've ever used is 120. Um, Silent shooting in interval. You could turn this on, and then your camera would not be using its shutter while taking the images for your interval shooting sequence. The only drawback to that is with the A7R4 and the earlier cameras, this drops your bit rate or your bit level of each image, I think down to 10 bit as opposed to 12 bit or 14 bit. Now, these raw files are supposed to be 14-bit RAWs, but from what I understand, the maximum that you'll actually get out of one of them is about 12 bits. But if you set it to silent shooting, you get down to 10 bits. So that reduces your dynamic range, I would say fairly significantly. So for the most part, I do not use silent shooting, but it does save shutter wear and shutter count. So you may find it advantageous. Plus, when you think about it, even if you're shooting 10-bit images, you're stacking them. So in the end, um, you will end up with the dynamic range of your kind of pile of images. So maybe it's okay for you, or uh, for your priorities. That'll work. Um, but just bear that in mind. The other thing to bear in mind about interval shooting on the A7R4 and some of the other cameras, um, it will not let you set a maximum exposure time more than 30 seconds. So you can't set it for like a whole minute or anything like that is my recollection here. So um, that may be a limitation. You'll end up with more shots of shorter duration if you go that route. Let's see. So moving on. Focus mode generally when you're doing your astrophotography with a camera lens, um, you may want to set this to manual focus. That way you can be precise with the focus. A lot of times the camera will not be able to autofocus on the stars. I have had some success with autofocus on stars, but it's limited. Priority set in autofocus single shot. You want to set this to release because if you set it to AF or autofocus, that means that it's not going to take the picture until it has successfully completed autofocus on the stars. Um, and if it's not able to autofocus on the stars, that it just won't ever take a picture. So that's problematic. So you generally want to set this to release. It'll release even if it's out of focus, is what that means. Um, but for manual focus, obviously, you're not even using the autofocus at all, and you don't have to worry about this setting. So, it just depends on whether you're using the autofocus at all. I intend to experiment with autofocus in the future because there are some autofocus programs that work with N.I.N.A that may actually work with this camera, and I'm going to play with those in the future. Most of these other settings you can ignore. Let's see. Pre-AF or pre-autofocus, I recommend keeping that off. Otherwise, it will try to focus even when you are not yourself touching the camera or trying to focus on the stars or anything, and that can just make it more difficult to get things set up for the night. Exposure, most of these things are going to be affected by how you set the exposure using manual exposure options on the camera. So most of this is going to be irrelevant for astrophotography. White balance, I will set to daylight for astrophotography. There are other options you could choose, or you could set a specific custom white balance if you're into that sort of thing. In the end, you'll probably make a lot of changes to the color or the white balance in your post processing. But I think daylight as a standard may make it simpler when you get to that point. The focus magnifier is a tool that a lot of Sony camera users would be making use of for astrophotography. What it does is it can magnify focus while you're focusing on the stars. And I'll see if I can demonstrate this here. And I've got certain settings on my own camera where um, I touch a button to set it into manual focus, and then here's what the focus magnifier looks like. It zooms in so you can see with great precision where your camera is focusing. Very, very precise. And that's useful when you're focusing on the stars with or without a Bahtinov mask. Um, sorry for the jiggling. Um, so this is a potentially useful tool, but you'll have to set the magnifier time probably to no limit so that you'll have time enough to really get focused in on those stars. The initial focus magnification, you can choose that. You can actually zoom in more while you're looking at the image. There's let's see if I can demonstrate this. Um, so you start with the focus magnifier on, and then there's a button on the back of the camera. It's the button that you use for selecting where the autofocus goes. It's a little joystick button with some tactile feel to it. If you press it in, it zooms in even more. and it gets super, super close. Um, so that's very exciting. At any rate, um, you could turn off auto, or you should probably turn off autofocus and focus magnifier. Um, it's very slow and it's supposed to be precise, but it really has trouble focusing on stars. It might work for the moon, um, but in my case, I've never yet found a use for it. MF Assist, that's manual focus assist. You will probably want that on because if you're using a Sony or Sony compatible lens, um, this will automatically turn on the focus magnifier whenever you switch to manual focus and when you're turning that focusing ring on the lens. On a telescope, it's not automatically going to know that you're manually focusing, so you'll have to set the camera to manual focus separately, either through the menus or by programming one of the custom buttons. Most of this you can ignore. Movies we don't care about. Uh, Silent shooting again. I spoke of that earlier. You want to turn that off, in my opinion, on these earlier Sony cameras because it does reduce the overall bit level of the raw files. And again, that's your choice. You could turn it on to save shutter actuations, but for my part, I leave it off. Electronic front curtain shutter. For astrophotography applications, you're usually using longer exposures. You may as well leave this on. The only purpose I know of for turning it off is to kind of improve the bokeh when shooting with lenses wide open at really wide apertures and very high shutter speeds during the daytime. So I don't think it matters for astrophotography, but you can leave that on. Release without lens. This is very important to enable this, mainly with um, telescopes, because the camera is not going to know that you have a telescope attached. It will know if you have a Sony compatible lens, um, but it will not know that you have a lens attached to it if it's a telescope because there's no electrical connection between the telescope and the camera, and it won't release or it won't take a picture if this is set to disable. Um, Setting it to disable will tell the camera will know or will think that there's no lens attached, and it'll think therefore it should not take a picture because uh, there won't be any good data there. Um, so we set that to enable. Release without card. This you could leave at disable. And you probably want to if you expect to uh, keep the images taken by your camera on the SD card that you have in the camera, in addition to having it downloaded to the computer. In theory, you could have all of the images only saved to the computer, and then you won't have to waste time downloading images from the SD card. But just bear in mind, this is an extra copy that you keep on the SD card. So it's really better to have copies of the raw files on the SD card as well as on the computer, um, just in case something fails, your hard drive fails or your SD card fails. You just have an extra copy of each of your images. The display button, no, that's not really relevant. There are some fun settings there that you can play with, but these are how I have mine set if it's of interest to anyone. I do have an option for monitor off so that the monitor will be black, and I can turn that on before I start the image sequence. And that way, if I'm out at a dark site, I don't have the back monitor on the camera glaring in the night. There's some custom key uh, functions that are potentially of use here. Um, Bright monitoring is something that some people do like to use for astrophotography because what it does is it brightens up the screen artificially so that you can see much better in the dark some dark structures or either among the landscape or in the sky. And it can help you sometimes find your target in the sky if the sky is brightened up a bit by the camera. Um, so this can help you at least with the initial locating your target in the sky, or if you're doing a landscape photo, sort of a landscape astrophoto, then you might use this so that you can see the landscape better for framing. So you have to set this to one of your custom keys in order for it to work. And you can see here I set it to that's the custom 3 button. Here it's labeled as number 4 on the back of the camera. But that could be a useful tool. But very important is the focus magnifier. I have it set to the trash can button on the back of the camera. It's custom button number 4. Here it's labeled number 5 in this diagram. And you'll want to set that on one of these custom keys so that in the dark you can feel around, touch it, and know that you're turning on your focus magnifier, dial in your focus on your stars, and then turn it back off or what have you. But yeah, that's one that you want to have programmed, I think. Network settings here. There are some settings here that are going to be important for controlling the camera from a computer. If you are controlling it with a computer, you have to turn off control with smartphone. So here I have it set off in my astrophotography setup. And the PC remote function needs to be turned on. Um, the most functional way for me has been to use USB connections. Um, in theory, you should be able to control it by Wi-Fi. I have not succeeded yet in doing so. Um, so I always have a USB connection, preferably using the USB-C port on my A7R4. Other A7 series cameras may not have the USB-C. And then the later cameras like the A7R5 and anything newer, I think they all tend to have USB-C now, which is great because it can move data faster. I'll show you these additional settings. They're maybe less critical for getting the camera to work with N.I.N.A or any other astrophotography software, but it's worth keeping these things in mind. Here is one of those settings where you want it to save the images to both the PC and the camera so that you have duplicates. Um, Now, again, in theory, if you prefer, you could set it to PC only. But if you have it set to camera only, most of your astrophotography software will be confused by this and it may not function if it doesn't have an image coming in to work with. Why? Well, because it needs those images to plate solve um, and to run other critical functions within the astrophotography software. So my understanding, your best bet here is to either do PC only or PC and camera. And I recommend the PC and camera. That way you have an extra set of the images. The PC save image size, I believe you'll always want to have it at original. For N.I.N.A, this seems, this would mean raw files, 61 megapixels on the A7R4. 2 megapixel files, sure, you could do that, but I believe what would happen is that you would no longer have raw files going to your PC, and that does not seem advantageous to me. Other settings here, I have airplane mode set off. You might be able to get away with having it on if you are using only a wired connection to your computer and so forth. Wi-Fi settings, you can make changes there if you need to, but that's going to be dependent on what sort of Wi-Fi setup you're using with your computer or with a router and so forth. Um, I have never yet had a use for that. Um, Bluetooth settings would be relevant if you're using a Bluetooth remote control or using your smartphone to trigger the camera. The problem is, if you're doing that, most likely it's going to prevent you from allowing PC control of the camera. So if you're using Nina or something like that to run your astrophotography sequence, then you're going to need to have all of this turned off and not be using Bluetooth, because otherwise it interrupts prevents the camera from being controlled by the PC. Um, and as I should mention, this is one of those things that if you're wondering why you can't get your camera set to be controlled by the PC, if it's grayed out like this command down here, um, under PC remote function, if this is gray, then that's probably because you've set it to control with smartphone, or you've set it to control via Bluetooth. Um, and as another side note, this send to computer function, that's more for copying or transferring files. You don't need to mess with that. It will be done automatically by N.I.N.A or the astrophotography program of your choice um, through the PC remote function options. In the setup menu, most of this you shouldn't need to mess with. I turn off the gamma display assistance because I prefer to set my monitor brightness manually. Um, and you probably would want to keep it that way, if you're working in the dark at a dark site. Deletion confirm, I'll just mention it while I'm here that I would always recommend putting it on cancel first, because you don't want to accidentally delete a file, especially at night or while working with gloves on. Um, if you go in to review your images through playback mode and you accidentally hit the trash can button and then accidentally hit the button again, you could accidentally delete your image. It's much better to have this on cancel first, just to be safe. These settings are pretty much irrelevant. Touch operation, I don't know. I think it's probably a bad idea to try to use the touch screen in the dark. Granted, the screen is lit up. It might be nice to use, but um, you can't really do finer control operations on the A7R4. Maybe you can on some other cameras, but to me, it just doesn't work super well for astrophotography. So I keep that off to avoid mistakes. Um, the USB LUN setting, this affects how data is transferred over the USB connection. Some cameras have this, I gather, some do not. Um, it's best to set it on it's like multi-threaded transmission of the data as opposed to single-threaded. At least that's my generic understanding of it. Um, so when you're connected to a computer using it to run your astrophotography sequence, I think it's very important to set this to multi. And USB power supply. Um, I leave this on at all times. It's good because your battery will drain more slowly overnight. It probably will still drain a bit. Um, I can always get through a night of astrophotography with one battery. I try to make sure that it's fully charged before I start. But yeah, I can't remember exactly how much battery usage I tend to get out of it, but I could probably run most of a night on a single battery without USB power supply. But since the same USB-C connection can transfer your data and power the camera, I think this is a win-win sort of situation to leave it on. Um, this may not be an option for all cameras. Um, I don't know about the earlier cameras, but this is a nice feature on the A7R4. This is one of those custom menus you can create on your camera. And on mine, I have certain settings in here that I like to have easily available or easily found. The idea here is that you don't have to dive through as many menus to find these settings as you would normally if they're all sort of collected here in this custom menu. To add commands, you go to the end of the menu where it says add item or sort item. You select add item and then it'll let you search through the menus and find what you want to add to your custom menu. But I've put in here formats that's mainly for other work that I do with my camera. Um, Record media settings. This just means you can quickly go here and choose which SD slot you're going to record images to. Uh, Steady shot settings. Sometimes you want to turn it off or turn it on in a hurry. Here's that interval function that allows you to set an interval of photos throughout the night. It's really quite handy when you're working in the dark and you want to um, you want to take a series of flat white images. So like you finished your astrophotography sequence, and the way that I use N.I.N.A, I don't have a way of telling it automatically to do flats. So when I go to the camera after it's completed for the night, completed its session, the next thing I'll do sometimes is set my interval and do a whole bunch of shots of flats. And I like to have it here in this menu to get to it quickly. Um, yeah, face registration, obviously, you don't need for astrophotography. Here's the electronic first curtain shutter and the PC remote function that I try to keep handy here for my astrophotography. So those are all my typical settings here. Um, if you have the settings set this way, it should work fine with N.I.N.A. Um, if you're using an A7R4 and some of the earlier cameras. Not so sure how this translates to the A7R5 or the A1 II or any of those later cameras. Um, but these settings should get you working with N.I.N.A and APT, the astrophotography tool software. And so hopefully these things will be useful to you. But just as a reminder, the PC remote function really has to be on. And if this is grayed out for some reason, that means that there's another setting somewhere in your menus that is turned on, like control with smartphone. You'll need to turn it off in order to be able to use your PC to run the astrophotography sequence. Um, I think I'll leave it there, and then if I am able to or have the setup or the wherewithal, I will maybe do another video with N.I.N.A incorporated in it with the whole setup. Lately, I have had no clear skies at night. It's been awful. Um, or maybe there's an hour or two between clouds, but I just have not gotten any astrophotography in. So for now, this video will have to do for the instructions on how to set up the A7R4 and similar Sony A7 cameras. I hope this is of some use to you folks out there. Feel free to like it, and I wouldn't say subscribe because I don't know how many videos like this I intend to do in the future, but um, by all means, subscribe and you know, and let me know down in the comments if there's something more that I can help with. If you're having trouble getting this to work with N.I.N.A or APT, I've done a little bit of work with APT. Mostly, I use N.I.N.A for my sessions, but in the future, I might do a video or two on APT. But again, I really hope this is helpful to people. And, if it is, let me know. I appreciate it. Cheers and clear skies.